What do Spiderman, Thor, Batman, what do they all have to do with sales? Besides being awesome movies, quick little side note, Thor 3 comes out November 3rd. I can't wait. So before these could become epic movies, they all had to start out as stories. Stories are powerful. They help us remember intricate details. They help us remember facts. That can either be facts or details that we're learning while listening to the story, or it might be something about our environment that we're going to be able to remember as we're hearing the story. For example, think of one of the classic Disney movies, The Lion King. I was 6 years old when this movie came out, and I can tell you what theater I was at when I was watching it. I can even tell you the day of the week. Who doesn't love Mufasa? Why do stories have this power over us? It's because stories, especially good stories, they evoke emotion. And when stories are told well, they don't only evoke emotion, but they can help us file away information into our brains into a way that helps us remember them better and be able to access that information in an easier way. So you're probably thinking, Max, what the heck? What does this have to do with sales? If you can tell better stories as you're selling, as you're pitching, as you're presenting, you're going to be able to be more impactful to your buyers. They're going to be able to remember you better, remember what you're saying, remember your product. You're going to be able to create different emotions in them that are going to make them want to buy specifically from you. So here's the thing. If you want to close more deals, get better at telling stories. One of the best in the business at telling stories when it comes to sales is Paul Smith. Paul has delivered keynotes and trainings to some titans of industry such as Google, Procter Gamble, Bayer Medicine. He has also had his work featured in Forbes, Wall Street Journal, and Time Magazine, just to name a few. And additionally, Paul has written 3 best-selling books: Lead with the Story, Sell with the Story, and Parenting with the Story. Paul was kind enough to share some time with me to have a discussion on how I can improve at telling better stories, and I want to share that discussion with you because he gives me some really great tips. Specifically, he gives me 8 things that every story needs to answer in order to be effective. And that doesn't matter if this story is, a quick 30-second story, if it's a 5-minute, 10-minute, or even an hour-long story. Every story to be effective needs to answer these 8 things. So you're going to want to stay tuned, check it out. Here is my personal conversation with Paul Smith. So Paul, how are you doing?
Oh, very good. And I'll do my best on that coaching in your car there.
Yes, I am in my car today. Being in outside sales, sometimes that's what happens. You have to do things from the car.
Good for you.
So I appreciate you being a good sport. It's I guess being in the car is another story for me to tell, right?
Exactly. And I would imagine in your line of work, if you don't spend a lot of time there, you're probably not making a lot of sales. So good for you.
Thank you. So Paul, a few months ago, I was listening to another podcast. I think it was you were on there with Anthony, Ian Marino, and you were telling a story about a picture frame that has or not a picture frame, but about a picture that has stuck with me.
Yeah.
And I believe it was about pigs, right? In the Caribbean.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to hear that, or do you want to take a stab at telling that story now?
No. Yeah. If you could give us a quick recap of that story, because I think it's an excellent point of why it's so important to tell stories.
Yeah, sure. So it was just a couple of summers ago. My wife and I were at an art fair in Cincinnati, Ohio, and she was looking for a picture for our son's bathroom at home. So we were going to each of the booths and checking out, all the art that they had there. And we got to this one booth of this underwater photographer, this guy named Chris Goog, and he just does these mesmerizing underwater shots of sea anemones and coral reefs and things like that. And my wife's looking through his pictures, and she just gets attached to this one picture that to me just looked about as out of place as a pig in the ocean. And the reason is because, as you know, it literally was a picture of a pig in the ocean. And I just thought that was silly, right? I mean, pigs don't swim, and they certainly aren't, seafaring animals, right? So it didn't make any sense to me. And I finally got my chance to ask the guy a question. I just said, dude, what's with the pig in the ocean? And he said, and that, Max, is when the magic started. He said, oh yeah, it was the craziest thing. He said, that picture was taken off the coast of this uninhabited island in the Bahamas called Big Major K. And he said, apparently what happened was a few years ago, some local entrepreneur decided to raise a pig farm for bacon, I guess. And he got all these pigs, and he found out there was this uninhabited island he could keep them on for free. So of course he throws them out there. And the artist tells me, he says, but look in the picture, like look there, behind the pig, up behind the beach, like what do you see back there? And I kind of squinted and I looked and I said, well, I don't see much up there other than cactus. And he said, yeah, that's a problem. Pigs don't like cactus, right? So they literally didn't have much to eat. Well, fortunately for the pigs, they realized that a local restaurant owner on a nearby island every day or every night was boating his kitchen refuse over to Big Major K and dumping it a few dozen yards offshore. Well, so pretty soon these pigs get hungry enough that, they're brave enough to go in the ocean to find this food because they can smell it. It's right there. Well, first one pig, then two pigs, then three pigs. And, here it is 3 or 4 generations later, and all the pigs can swim. They've been trained to. And of course, at that point, I've got my credit card out and I'm like, okay, we'll take it. We'll take the picture, right? And, ask yourself why. Because 2 minutes earlier, that picture was worth nothing to me, right? Or little more than the paper it was printed on. But after hearing that story, it was worth so much more because it wasn't just a picture anymore. It was a story, a story that I can tell to you and other people. And I love to tell when people come to my house and use the bathroom. And, it was this history lesson and geography lesson and animal psychology lesson all kind of rolled into one. So it was the story literally made the picture more valuable to me, and I had to have it. So we bought it right there.
I love that. And I think you summoned why I love that story perfectly. It's the story created the value for you. And I think that's super, critical in sales. So what kind of stories create value, and how can we as salespeople know which story to tell?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think stories like that literally add value to the product, I think is only one of a couple of dozen different types of stories that salespeople ought to be able to tell and to have in their repertoire. So the better question may not be, what kinds of stories add value, but what kind of stories do I need to tell? And one of the kind of stories you need to be able to tell is a story like that adds value to the product you sell. But there are other types of stories that you should be able to tell as well. Stories about yourself when you're just introducing yourself to a prospect for the first time. Stories to help you build rapport with the prospect, like stories about the founding of your company or the invention of the product that you're selling. Stories that you can tell during the actual sales pitch itself, like a story, what I call a problem story, or a happy customer story, a story about the problem that your product or service is designed to solve, or a story like that, except it's got a happy ending because somebody came and bought your product or your service, and so it solved the problem. There are even stories that salespeople can tell that create a sense of urgency to help them close the sale now and not a month from now or 6 months from now. And loyalty building stories that you can tell after the sale to a customer that's part of your ongoing customer relationship management. So really the better question is, which stories do I need? Because all of them aren't going to be the kind that add value to the product. So they serve all kinds of different purposes throughout the entire sales process, and that's just one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know it's important for us in sales, and me in particular, to be able to tell stories. But how can I tell a better story? I mean, that's something I feel is difficult, is the kind of the nitty gritty of actually telling the story. And you being an expert in storytelling, I was wondering if you could share a few pointers and things that you do to help make a story better.
Yeah. So it starts, of course, with having a good story to tell. I mean, we're not talking about fiction here. So we're not novelists where we're just making stuff up and creating a good story. It starts with finding the right content for a story. So it starts with, what is it that I want my audience to think, feel, or do after hearing this story? And then think of, and the three places you should go look for it then, is think of a success, a failure, or a moment of clarity around that thing that you want them to think, feel, or do. So in other words, think of a time you've seen that done well or done really awfully, because people learn from mistakes just like they learn from successes, or the time that you learned that lesson the first time. To tell about that moment in time. And so those are the three most effective places to look to find a story. So that's where to start. But if you're looking for tips on the crafting of the story, the best place to start there is the structure. So stories have a structure to them. And in fact, I think there are 8 questions that any story needs to answer, and it should be able to answer them in this particular order. So I'll give you these 8 questions, and I can send them to you, and you can put them on your website or whatever you want to do with them. But it starts with, why should I listen to this story? Right? If you don't answer that question in the first few seconds, your audience might not listen to your story. They might not listen to you for the next 2 minutes. They'll either physically, emotionally, or mentally walk away, right? So that's the first question. Why should I bother listening to this story? Then you get into the main questions of the story. Where and when did it take place? Who's the main character and what did they want? What was the problem or the opportunity that they ran into? What did they do about it? And then how did it turn out in the end? Okay, so those are the basic questions that stories need to answer. And if you're counting, that's not 8 yet, that's only 6. So there are a couple other questions you got to answer after you've told the story, which is, what did you learn from it? And what do you think I should do now? If I'm the buyer and I'm asking you, what did you learn from it? And what do you think I, as the buyer, should do now that I've heard that? That's your opportunity to make a recommendation, probably selling your product. So those are the 8 questions. And if your story answers those 8, it's got the right flow of a story for the human mind to appreciate as a story and to be compelling, but yet it's short enough that you can do it in 2 minutes, and it's not a 17-step storytelling process, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So should salespeople, should they be writing these stories down before they tell them, do you think that would be a good practice?
So my answer is they should only write them down, I think, in bullet point format. And here's why. Because one of the questions I asked when I was doing the research for my latest book, I not only did I interview salespeople, I interviewed professional buyers, so professional procurement managers, the kind of people that you meet with every day probably. And I was asking them, one of the questions I asked them was, what is it that makes a sales pitch sound like a sales pitch? And I got all kinds of interesting answers, but the most common answer I got was when the tone of the conversation changes from conversational and extemporaneous to something that sounds memorized and practiced and rehearsed and scripted. And so that's when the hairs on the back of their neck will stand up, and that's when their guard goes up and their defenses go up, and they know that the sale is on now. And you don't want to communicate that and to make that happen, right? So the best way to make your sales pitch in general, but your sales stories in particular, not sound like sales pitches is to not memorize them. And the best way to not memorize them is to never write them down word for word in the first place. Because if you do that, of course, you're going to be tempted to just memorize it. So I recommend just writing down the bullet points of the answers to those 8 questions. And then you've got 8 questions you need to answer in the order in which you need to answer them. And what's going to come out of your mouth every time is a slightly differently told story. And it's going to sound conversational and extemporaneous. It'll sound like the first time you've ever told the story, because it will be the first time you've ever told the story exactly that way before, because you've not memorized it.
Yeah, that's fantastic advice. I really like that, those 8 questions, and I will include those in the summary for everybody who's watching and listening, because I think I know if I can do better at hitting those 8 points, I'm sure it will help me close more deals.
I would think so.
Now, Paul, something that I really struggle with too is I have this limiting belief where I'm not an interesting person. And I think I don't have a good story to tell. I hear your story and you're talking about this pig, and I'm like, man, that is awesome. I want a story. I want a pig story.
Yeah.
And so how can we get better at brainstorming and making our own stories maybe seem more interesting, or what can we do here?
Yeah. So two things I just heard. How can I get my own pig stories, my own really cool stories like that? And then once I have some stories, how can I get them to be more interesting? So two separate questions. For the first one, the way you get more interesting stories like that is be intentional about finding really interesting stories. Most people, it never occurs to them to have a database of stories. But of course, you need one. Like you certainly have a database of all your clients and your prospects, and you probably have file drawers and computer files full of and folders full of your sales pitches and brochures and documents and price lists and order guides. You've got well databased and documented everything that you need for your job, except for well documented and databased stories. You should get some. You should intentionally go on story hunts to find. So start with, what are the stories that I need? And I can send you the list of the 25 types of stories I think most salespeople need to have, and then literally go look for them. Like talk to your peers, your current clients. A lot of those stories you're going to find there because they're customer stories. Your boss, your subordinates, other people, your family. I mean, go on a hunt for them. And there's a lot of advice in the book about where else to find them. I mean, create opportunities for people to share their stories with you, but be intentional about it. As far as taking existing stories and making them more interesting, the two probably most effective techniques you're going to have there is emotion and surprise. So weave in some emotional components to your stories, and we can talk about how to do that if you have time. And something surprising. That's the element of surprise. And in fact, there's a very simple technique that I coach my clients and that I share in the book on how to create a surprise ending to any story, and it just makes it so much more memorable. So if you're interested, I can share that with you right now.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That would be extremely helpful.
Yeah, so I'll just give you an example. So there's this kid, 9-year-old kid named James. He's in the kitchen with his mom and his mom's sister. So while mom and auntie are at the table having a cup of tea, young 9-year-old James is at the stove watching the tea kettle boil, right? And he's just fascinated with it, right? He's watching the steam come out the top of the tea kettle, and he's got a spoon and he's holding it up there and watching the jet of steam condense on the spoon and little drops of water, coming down the spoon and dripping into a cup. And he's just watching the cycle go over and over and over again. He's just fascinated with it. Well, eventually his mother just, kind of barks at him. She's like, James, like, go do your homework. Go outside and play. Read a book. Do something. Like, aren't you ashamed of yourself the way you're just, wasting your time in here? Well, fortunately, young 9-year-old James was undaunted by his mother's admonition, because 20 years later, at the age of 29, and in the year 1765, James Watt reinvented the steam engine, ushering in the Industrial Revolution that we, of course, all benefit from today, and all based on a fascination with steam that he developed in his mother's kitchen 20 years earlier. Okay. Now, you probably didn't know that story was about James Watt, the inventor of the steam engine, until the end of the story, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Right. But I did, and of course, and when I read that story the first time, it was in a book titled James Watt, written in 1905 by Andrew Carnegie. Okay, so it was no surprise to me at all that the story in chapter 1 about 9-year-old James in the kitchen with his mom was about James Watt. The whole book was about James Watt. But to you, it was a surprise. And why? Because I did one simple thing. I took one vital piece of information from the beginning of the story, his last name, and I didn't give it to you until the end of the story, right? Presto, surprise ending. All right, it's that simple. So take something important from the beginning of a story and save it until the end, and you create a natural surprise ending, which will make the story so much more powerful.
Yeah, it does definitely make it more powerful. It captures your listener. They listen to the whole story, and I bet when you have that surprise ending, they'll probably remember it more.
Exactly.
Which in sales is going to help you close more deals, because if you're the salesperson that does a presentation that's memorable, especially when you have multiple decision makers, you're often going to be the one that ends walking away with the deal.
Exactly. Yeah, and there's a lot of science behind why this works, but having a surprise at the end of your story, as you said, it literally does make the entire story, and especially the lesson and recommendation at the end, more memorable, which is exactly why I suggest you do it. It's not just to make it more entertaining. I mean, it does that too, but I recommend it for a very practical reason, that it does exactly what you said. It makes the whole story more memorable to the audience.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Paul, for sharing that. And then you also mentioned about how to tie a little bit more emotion into it. Do you have any tips that we can use to make our stories maybe sound more emotional?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, don't be afraid of emotion. The main reason why most people's stories about other people and things that happened don't have a lot of emotion in them is because they take the emotion out intentionally. The emotion happens every day. I mean, most conversations you have that are interesting have some emotion in it. Somebody's either excited or angry or mad or happy or ecstatic. I mean, right? But when we go to tell a story about that at work, we for some reason think that, well, this is professional now, so I need to kind of get all that out of the story. And so we do it on purpose. So step one is just don't do that. Leave that stuff in. It is very appropriate for work. And a second way to do it is with dialogue, right? So people say how they feel. It's in the tone of their voice and it's in the words that they say. And so when you tell a story, if you leave out the dialogue and you just say what happened in third person as if you were recounting a case study, then that ruins the emotion as well. So leave the dialogue in. I mean, even if you have to, paraphrase, well, I think what Bob said was this, and I think what Sally said was this. That's good enough. I mean, just kind of paraphrase it because they're going to say what they think and feel, and it's going to come through. So those two things will take you a long way.
Okay, so keeping the dialogue in, and then also not being afraid to show the emotion.
Yeah.
And I'm going to just take a stab in the dark here, but do you have any techniques that you do to help your clients show more emotion? Because I know for me, like I naturally subdue it, and I would like to get better at sharing emotion. I especially do it when I'm on video, I feel.
Right.
So do you have any techniques or anything that you suggest to people to maybe do on a daily basis to help them resurrect their emotions?
Yeah. So I think I should just correct what I was trying to say because I probably didn't communicate it right. I'm not suggesting that you show emotion yourself when you're telling the story necessarily. Like I'm not suggesting that if you tell a sad story that you should break down and cry as you're telling the story. In fact, I recommend against that. Right? In fact, the more emotional the story is, the more kind of dry and deadpan you should deliver it. The story should be emotional, and you should be telling stories that elicit emotion in your audience, not in yourself. If you're a bundle of emotional nerves as you're telling the story, that's not going to be effective. If you're a Hollywood, actor or you're on Broadway, yes, you're supposed to do that. But that's not what we do in the workplace, and that's not what you should do in a sales call. Right? You should be calm, cool, and collected. You should tell stories that elicit some interesting emotion from your audience. So there is a difference, and the techniques like dialogue will help you do that. Techniques like using words to describe the physical manifestations of the emotion in the character in the story. So instead of just saying she was sad, say she cried. Or instead of saying he was angry, say he yelled at me. So the things that they're doing will suggest to the audience the emotion that they had without you having to say she was angry, he was sad, that's at a minimum you can do that, but you can do better by communicating the emotion by describing the physical. His face was all red, and you could see that vein in his in his temples stick out that always does when he gets really upset. Those kind of things will let your audience know the emotions that are going on without you hitting them over the head with it.
I like that a lot. I think that's one of those little things that good storytellers do that maybe the rest of us are probably lacking. So I'm going to definitely be using that. Thank you. That's an excellent piece of advice.
Don't burst into tears. That's not going to help anybody. That's not going to help you sell anything.
While you've been talking to buyers and interviewing buyers about storytelling, were there any particular emotions that you noticed or that buyers would commonly share that would lead to a purchase? Is there a specific emotion that we should be trying to evoke?
Yeah. Yeah, the best one is probably empathy. So, and especially like when you tell a story about a one of their customers or their potential customers, and a problem that they had, that customer had, and the bad situation it put them in, and how badly it made them feel, or cost them a lot of money, or caused some emotional relationship damage, or whatever the problem that your product solves, letting them empathize with that person enough that they will want that problem solved for them. And by the way, it's no surprise that your product or service is the solution to that thing, right? But you need them to empathize with the person that has the problem. If it's not the buyer themselves, if it's the buyer themselves, then it'll be pretty easy to generate that empathy. But if the problem lies somewhere else in the company, you need to help them generate empathy for that situation.
Mm. And so going back to the topic of having maybe personally feeling a lack of stories, what's your perspective on using other people's stories? So if I don't have a specific story, is it okay for me to use one of my coworkers' stories? Is that okay?
Yeah, it certainly is. You just want to, attribute it properly. What you don't want to do is tell somebody else's story as if it was yours, or that it was about you. You don't want to end up being a liar. But yeah, so if it's a story about your company or about your customers or about somebody in general, then of course you can borrow these stories and tell them all the time. If it's a story that your peer tells about themselves, then you obviously don't want to take that and tell it as if it was about you, because now you're just lying, right? But as long as you do that, as long as you're not misleading the audience as to whose story this is and who it's about, yeah, you can. In fact, you should. In fact, let me just ask you, what would you think about somebody whose every story they told was about themselves?
Naturally, I would think that they were very self-centered.
Exactly. And is that the kind of person you want to do business with?
No. Yeah.
So you need a repertoire of stories, and if they're all about you, that's a problem. So you need stories about other people, and which probably means you need stories from other people in your repertoire. And even of the stories that are about you, some of them need to be your own failure stories, mistakes that you made, self-deprecating stories that really humanizes you to your audience. Plus, it also lets your buyer know, look, I'll admit to my mistakes. When I make a mistake, you'll be the first to know about it. I'm not one of these guys that's going to hide, any mistakes and blame other people and whatever. And I don't make mistakes all the time, but I'm human. So I do occasionally. And here's one of them. And here's what I did about it. And here's why that customer has been a customer of mine for 15 years after I made that mistake, because they knew that I would come and tell them exactly when I made the mistake, and I will make it right with them. That's what they want to hear from you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Paul, for taking your time and sharing with me about how I can tell better stories, and how to, have not create personal emotion, but emotion in the buyers, and
Yes.
develop that empathy and all these things. So yeah, I'm looking forward to, you know, getting a list of the different stories that I should have in my repertoire, and also getting those 8 points written out on those stories that I need to answer. I think if I can do those things, and if everybody watching and listening can do those things, we'll all be able to close more deals. I have no doubt in that. So
I'm sure of it. Good
well,
luck.
thank you, Paul. I appreciate it. And Paul, where can our viewers, where can they go get more information about you?
Yeah, my website's probably the easiest place, which is leadwithastory.com. So my books and the training classes I teach are it's all there, and my contact information. So leadwithastory.com.
Awesome. And I'll include that in the show notes as well.
Thanks.
Well, thanks again, Paul. I appreciate your time, and thank you for being here with us.
You bet. Good luck on the road today.
All right, thanks. So there you have it, my conversation with Paul. I hope you've enjoyed it. Be sure to check out some of the show notes there. I have information on where you can connect with Paul. Also, you can find his books. I also have a link that will take you back to the Help Me Close website, where you can get those 8 things that each story needs to answer. If you have enjoyed this video, please click the thumbs up so I know that you've enjoyed this content, and I'll keep creating more of it. And also be sure to subscribe so you'll be notified when I am releasing these new videos. Thanks again for watching, and keep closing.